I'm Mark Dawson from the Self-Publishing Show, and this is Self-Publishing Spotlight, where we shine a light on the indie authors who are changing the world of publishing, one book at a time.
Hello and welcome to the Self-Publishing Spotlight. We meet indie authors at all stages of their careers and ask them a series of 5 questions. 5 questions about their process, their mistakes and their successes, 5 answers that will help you level up your own author career. My name's Tom Ashford and I'm part of the Self-Publishing Formula. Don't forget that you can get your self-publishing resource kit at selfpublishingformula.com/starter kit. This week's guest is, well, if you don't recognise this week's guest, I suggest you take a look at the branding because it's none other than Mark Dawson. Hello, Mark.
Hello, young Tom. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. Just saying off record, I'm in childcare mode at the moment, so my daughter is in the other room, so there's a fair chance we may have a 7-year-old coming through at some point, so we'll bear that in mind.
Special guest.
Special guest, exactly, yes.
Now, normally I introduce an author by saying how many books they've written, but I'm not actually sure how many you have written.
Well, that's 2 of us. It's somewhere, certainly more than 30. It's probably about 35 now. So there's 14 books in the Milton series, with the 15th, which will be out in a couple of months. Then several spin-offs, a couple of standalones, some novellas, and the first ones I wrote were kind of noir detective stories, Soho noir books I called them. They were published 7 years ago, something like that. So yeah, I've written a few. Yeah,
and the new Milton book's called Bright Lights, isn't it? I think it was announced yesterday or something.
Yes, it is called Bright Lights, which is set in Vegas, and where are we? Vegas, Siena, El Salvador, and San Francisco. So it's a bit of a globe-trotting book, but it's it's been fun to write.
Cool. Okay, well, let's jump straight in with question 1, the trickiest one, which is, why do you write?
Well, I should say, first of all, I helped write these questions, and I can't remember any of them. So this is, and I've done no preparation, which is kind of sums me up at the moment. But why do I write? Well, I've always written, really. I can remember going all the way back to when I was a teenager, in my early teens, actually, staying behind in middle school, and being allowed to sit in front of a BBC microcomputer in the maths department, I think it was, with my maths teacher, who was called Mr. Gutteridge, and my English teacher, who was Mrs. or Miss Harrod Eagles. And they were both wonderful. They would sit down there, let me kind of tap away. She would be kind of doing some marking, I think, and would occasionally help me with what I was writing. And I think it's such a long time ago, I can't remember exactly, but I think I finished like a 20,000 word novella, which to me in those days sounded like kind of like War and Peace. Yeah. It was called Planet Pirates, and it was science fiction, and it was absolutely terrible. I did try and find it the other day to see if I still had a copy, and thankfully for everyone, I didn't. I couldn't find it. So that was when I started, and I suppose I've always kind of doodled around with writing, with a few breaks, quite a long break actually between going to university and then starting work in London as a lawyer. And a friend of mine came into the office one day and said that he'd written a novel, and he asked me to read it, and I did, and it wasn't very good. But the impressive thing was he'd actually finished a novel, which was something I tried and failed to do on numerous occasions, and it was the impetus I needed to get back down to it again. And in a kind of a blaze of creativity. I'm not quite sure why I was so driven in those days, but I finished my first novel in about 3 months, and got an agent very easily, got a publisher very easily. Neither of those are things I expected to happen, but the stars seemed to align for me, and the book was published. And that was what I hoped would be the start of my illustrious new career as an author. Didn't quite turn out that way. The first book and the second book didn't sell very well, and I actually stopped writing again for about 7 years until the Kindle came along, and that was when things really started to pick up.
Cool. So would you ever go back to traditional publishing, do you think? Or would you rather stick with sort of the indie hybrid?
I'm agnostic about that, really. My view is that it's all about the story, and I don't really care how the story is delivered. It could be with dead trees, or with or by way of files. I don't really care. I just want to get my words into the hands of readers. Now, saying that, obviously, I'm also a business person, and I've got a mortgage to pay, 2 kids to put through school. So my decision is always going to be coloured by the financial implications of the choice that I make. And I know now, after publishing 35 books myself, that it's the grass is pretty green on the indie side of the fence. But saying that, I mean, I've got a new book I'm going to finish after this Milton book called The House in the Woods, which is the first book in a new series starring a new character. I probably will get my agent to pitch that around London, just really for shits and giggles, really, just to see what the response is. If someone comes to me and says, we'll give you £1 million for 3 books, I would probably take that deal. I'm not saying I definitely would, because although that sounds like quite a lot, I know what's possible with indie, but I probably would take a deal of that magnitude. Now, on the other side of the coin, that probably wouldn't be a decision that I'd be put in a position to make, because even though I've sold millions of books myself, most of London, most of the big publishers, I don't think would know who I was, and I don't think they would be able to, even if they loved the book, I don't think they'd be able to get away a deal. They'd be able to get the sign off for a deal that would be big enough for me to not publish it myself. So, that's a long way of saying I'm open to anything, but I'm pretty comfortable doing this myself.
Okay. So question number 2 is, how do you write?
Well, I tend to write in the mornings. I'm obviously pretty busy. So I've got 2 businesses really. There's SPF on the one hand, which is kind of like the non-fiction business. And then there's the books. And whereas SPF, there's probably about 8 or 9 of us now spread around the world working on that. For my books, it really is only me. So there is a lot to do. But the most important thing as a writer is obviously to write, to produce new content. So I tend to get to my desk around about 8:30 in the mornings after dropping the kids to school. And then I'll write. I try to get into the habit at the moment of just writing in the mornings. If I'm doing fresh words, I'll try and do between 2,000 and 3,000 words a day. That's a fairly comfortable number for me. And once I've done that, I'll kind of take a walk to recharge the batteries, and then I'll do whatever else needs to be done for answering reader email, marketing, advertising, SPF stuff, contracts, speaking to my agent. There's a never-ending list of things that need to be done. Translations now, that's another big area for me. Yeah. So that's how my day tends to look, and then the actual physical act of writing. I type for most of it, so I have a very nice mechanical Bluetooth keyboard, a quirky writer, which I've posted pictures of before, really nice. I use Scrivener, so I'm writing into Scrivener with that most of the time. Fairly recently, I have started to quite enjoy dictation, so I've also got Dragon, and if I'm in the kind of discovery writing phase, I'll often just kind of switch the microphone on, usually turn away from the screen, sometimes close my eyes and just tell the story. And to my great surprise, I didn't expect this to work for me, but to my surprise, it has worked. And the word count is prodigious compared to what I can manage when I'm typing, maybe 5,000 words an hour. So it's if I can do a couple of hours of that, that's really 10,000 words a day for me. That's ludicrous. Obviously, that needs a bit more editing to get it into a shipshape fashion, but it's still a pretty crazy level of production, which I'm still looking at.
That could be like a book a week.
It could. Well, there are writers. We've had a couple on the podcast recently who I don't think they dictate. I'm thinking of Amanda Lee. May not have been on the podcast by the time this goes out, but she would. I think she publishes one every 3 weeks, certainly one a month. I'm nowhere near that kind of level of productivity, so I'll kind of take my hat off to writers who can write that quickly and as well as she does. But for me, if I can do 4 books a year, I'd accept that as a pretty decent year.
Okay, and are you more of a plotter or do you wing it?
I am somewhere in the middle. So when I started writing the Soho Noir books, I plotted them very, very religiously. The kind of the romantic notion of I got these big felt boards put up in my old study, and I had all these index cards that I would use drawing pins and put them onto the board, and then I'd move them around as I thought of plot ideas, and it was a fairly physical, fun way of imagining what the story would look like. Since then, I guess probably because I'm slightly more confident in myself as a storyteller, I tend to start with an idea or even a place sometimes, or something I've read in the newspapers. So, for example, I watched Chernobyl recently, the HBO Sky production.
Yeah.
Completely loved it, blew me away. And now I'm thinking about writing something about Chernobyl.
Ah.
And the way I would do that would be I would probably start with I'd be thinking about, right, what if it wasn't what we were told? What if it was something else? Now, there's loads of conspiracy theories, all of which are almost certainly nonsense about the Chernobyl disaster. But I think about that, and I start to that would be kind of percolating in my head. I probably won't get to write this until next year, but I'll be thinking about it every now and again, just kind of thinking about what might have happened, and if that happened, then what would happen? What would happen to those characters? So I'm always thinking about that. Then when it comes down to actually writing it, what I would tend to do is to open a Scrivener file, and in the binder, I would just maybe put down 20 or 30 chapters and maybe a couple of scenes in each chapter. And on the chapter level, I would put down a rough idea of what might happen in that chapter. And I also just, my brain tends to work my stories tend to be contained within a 5 or 6 day period. So I don't usually do sprawling books that take place over the course of years. In fact, I don't think I've ever done that. They always tend to be fairly chronologically compressed. And what I would do would be I'd have chapter, it would be like day 1, and then I'd put a rough time down, so 9 a.m. And then I'd think, okay, what would happen next? What are the steps I need to get to the next big point that I want to cover? And by doing that, and by shuffling them around, and by continuing to tweak them without doing any actual writing, by the time I get down to writing, I'll have a rough idea of where I am. And the best analogy I've ever heard that describes how I do that and how other writers who use that kind of method perform that task is, I think it was John Cheever, I think it was, who said, and this is a bit pretentious, so apologies for that, but it's writers who write that way know where it's like driving at night in the countryside. You know where you're starting, you might know where you're going to stop midway, and you know where you're ending, but the rest of the journey is picked out by as far as you can see in the headlights. And that's kind of the way that I write. It's a mixture of discovery writing and fairly loose plotting. That tends to work quite well for me.
Okay. Now, question number 3 is not really designed for you, I'm going to be honest, because it's, are you a full-time author? If you are, how did you get there? And if you aren't, what steps are you taking to make it happen?
I am a full-time author, and I have been since the 28th of November 2014, so 4.5 years now, which has gone by in an absolute flash, to be completely honest. The steps I took, it has always been to be as professional as possible, to treat it as a business. Before all of that, actually, is to write books that my readers enjoy, and to continue improving, and to continue writing the next book. So the year I left, 2013, 2014, I must have written about 6 or 7 novels in that time. That was whilst commuting backwards and forwards to London. So writing on the 3 hours a day I had on the train. It's a super productive time, very, very, really productive time, and a very prolific time for me. And it was learning about advertising. That was a key moment for me. That was kind of the accelerant moment. I started to use Facebook ads in around about end of 2013, beginning of 2014. And that it was really those that took me from selling pretty well. So earning in January 2014, I think I was earning what I was earning at the day job. And when I left in November, I was probably earning about 6 times what I was earning in the day job. And apart from writing more books, the only other thing that changed was that I was teaching myself how to effectively advertise. And in those days, it was really only Facebook. And that was the moment that I was able to kind of, I remember my wife saying to me, look, you got to think about what your time is worth. Do you want to spend 8 hours a day watching TV, which is what I did for a living with James and John, weirdly enough, or is your time better spent, more productively spent, both emotionally, professionally, financially? Is it better spent writing new books? And by that stage, there was no question. It would have been self-sabotaging to continue with the day job. So I gleefully handed in my notice and and sailed off into the sunset. But weirdly enough, I don't know if I mentioned this before. The day I left, or the day I handed my notice in, I got an email from the head of KDP in London saying there's a problem with my account, which was quite worrying. Fortunately, they'd overpaid me by a hell of a lot, and it wasn't anything more serious than that. But it was interesting timing.
So you're not saying that you left full-time employment in order to get away from James and John?
Well, they had actually gone. They had left by then. They the BBFC was downsizing, had been downsizing for the last 12 months, and I think John went first, and then James went. They pocketed nice redundancy checks, and then invested in their first business together. And it was only, I think I must have left about a year after they did, maybe 6 months after that, we got in touch again and started talking about SPF, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Okay. So question 4 is, what mistakes do you think you've made and what have you got right?
I've made tons of mistakes. Originally, the obvious one that I've told a few times is way back at the start when The Black Mile was published. That was the first book, 2012, 2013. I did a freebie giveaway. It was in Select. I did one of those free giveaways where you get 5 days every 3 months with Amazon. And I set it free, forgot about it. I think I may have done a free booksy in there as well. Went for a bike ride in the summertime. It was August, I think, and I just checked my phone and just expected to see maybe I had 50 or 100 downloads, and it was something like 50,000 downloads, which was ridiculous. And once I'd gotten over the shock of that, my next thought was, I don't have. How do I contact them afterwards? And they've got nothing else to read because it was the only book I had out. There was no reader magnet. I don't think anyone was even thinking about reader magnets in those days. There was no mailing list sign up. There was nothing. So I probably cost myself a little bit of time getting going. That was an opportunity that I missed. And obviously I don't do that now. I religiously and diligently harvest emails and get readers onto the mailing list every opportunity that I get. So that's a pretty big mistake. I made tons of mistakes with Facebook ads in the early days. I think my first attempt was to try and get people to in Kindle Unlimited to download my books, and I just could not get those to work. It was only when I switched to trying to build the mailing list with Facebook ads that I saw it was possible. And then when I started advertising a box set, I remember in those days seeing huge numbers, 400 to 500% returns. So, spending 10, making 50, spending 1,000, making 5,000. And I remember speaking to my accountant and saying that, I am not good at maths, not one of my strengths. And I said to him that I think I'm making like 5 times what I'm investing. And can you check to make sure that it's right? And I remember him calling back and saying, effectively, you've discovered like a great big ATM, and can I invest some money in it? So that was a mistake, and then a way to correct it and push on. And I'd made lots of mistakes, but my mantra is it's okay to make a mistake once, provided that you learn from it and you don't make it twice. So I always try to learn from errors and move on and improve.
Okay, and last but not least. Question number 5, what's your final piece of advice for authors starting out in indie publishing?
It's obviously write. So if you want to be a writer, you've got to have something to sell. So we put craft aside for the moment. My best piece of advice is just treat it like a business and be professional, because you're going to be judged. You're going to be competing with authors like me if you're writing thrillers, and traditionally published authors. Loads of very professional indies now. Traditionally published books still have great covers. They're well edited most of the time, and that's what you're going to be competing with. You're going to be on those Amazon shelves fighting for reader attention and reader dollars or pounds or whatever, or euros, wherever you are. You're competing with those rivals for readers. So you need to make sure that your book is indistinguishable from all of those. So that means you can't get away with a cover that you've made yourself in, unless you are a cover designer, I think, or you've taken a course so you understand the tenets of cover design. I don't think you can get away with that these days. I personally don't think you can get away without a thorough edit. Others will just disagree with me on that, but my own philosophy is that I hate a single typo is one typo too many for me. So that's not to say that there aren't any in my books, but I will do everything I can to make sure that they are tracked down and annihilated. So there's that. Make sure that your product page looks amazing. There are no mistakes on it. That you price competitively, but you also value your work. Treat it like a business. Think about what successful indies are doing. Find ones that are like you, and then model them. So when I started out, people like Hugh Howey and Russell Blake were doing very well. And obviously, we've had both of those on the podcast over the years we've been doing it. But I remember looking at their posts on Kboards and thinking, my God, they're so far ahead of me. I'll never, ever get there. But I would look at what they were doing. I would try to distill their best practice and put that into my own business, and then work to improve that as well. So to maybe take it in my own direction, maybe improve it a little. So that's what I'd recommend is be professional, go in with your eyes open. It's not easy, but as we say on the other podcast, there's never been a better time to be a writer. So it's an amazing time to be writing right now.
Okay, well that's it. That's the 5 questions. That was brilliant. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for making time.
You're very welcome, Tom. And you didn't say cool. I think you said cool once. I should say for listeners, my wife, we were on a holiday last week, and my wife listened to the first 5 Spotlight podcasts, and she loved them. So young Tom, you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you.
But she did say, and we all do this. I do it too. So does James. We all have little verbal tics, and Lucy said, "You've got to tell Tom to stop saying cool." And now, of course, now that I've said that, it's going to be in your head, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every time. And so I have to apologize for that.
I was thinking of replacing it with words like radical and sick over and over again. Just
and I love that.
Getting steadily worse.
Would be a good one.
Spacious, yeah.
Out of the 80s. But yes, thank you very much, young Tom. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's Self-Publishing Spotlight. Don't forget that you can get your free self-publishing resource kit at selfpublishingformula.com/starter kit. And if you want to appear as a guest on this show, send us brief details about yourself and your writing to selfpublishingformula.com/spotlight-guest. I'm Tom Ashford, and I'll see you again next week.